What did the night actually feel like before electric light existed anywhere on Earth? It's a quiet question, but it opens into a surprisingly full world. For most of human history, night was not simply the pause between one day and the next. It was its own kind of place, governed by different rules, different sounds, different dangers, and different comforts than the daylight hours. And the people who lived through those nights, whether in a limestone cave in Ice Age Europe or a mud brick house on the banks of the Euphrates, all had to answer the same basic question in their own way. What do we do now that the sun is gone? This documentary is an unhurried walk through that question across a very long stretch of time. We'll begin with the earliest evidence of controlled fire, tens of thousands of years before writing existed, and move slowly forward through the river civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt into the villages, ports, and cities of the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. Along the way, we'll meet ordinary people, a watchman walking the mud brick wall of a Sumerian city, a fisherman checking his nets on the Nile in darkness, a lamplighter making his rounds through narrow streets. None of them are famous. That is rather the point. The history of night belongs mostly to people whose names were never recorded, and yet whose habits shaped how humanity has always related to rest, safety, and darkness. Before we go further, it's worth clearing away a common assumption. It is tempting to imagine ancient night as something purely fearful, a time when people huddled together, waiting anxiously for dawn. Some fear was certainly present. Darkness did hide real dangers, from predators to raiders to the simple risk of a fall on an unlit path. But the evidence historians and archaeologists have gathered paints a fuller picture. Night was also when stories were told, when dough was left to rise, when boats set out to catch fish that surfaced only after sunset, when priests kept vigil beneath the stars, and when families simply sat together near a small fire and let the day settle. Archaeologists have found something rather moving in this regard. Traces of hearths arranged in the same spot for generations at certain cave sites suggest that particular families or groups returned to the same fire night after night, year after year for a very long time. Evidence remains limited about the exact nature of these gatherings, since no one recorded their conversations, but the physical trace, ash layers built one atop another over centuries, tells us that the human night, even in its earliest form, was already a place of continuity and shared warmth. As this documentary moves through the ancient world, notice how each culture adapted to darkness, and also how many of their solutions rhyme with each other across enormous distances of time and geography. Lamps filled with oil appear independently in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and later Rome. Night watches, walking a fixed perimeter at fixed intervals, appear in cities that had no contact with one another. Dream interpretation, in some form, appears almost everywhere humans have left written records. There seems to be something close to universal in how people have always tried to bring a little order and meaning into the darkest hours. We will move gently through these ideas tonight, not rushing to conclusions, not chasing drama, simply following the evidence where it leads. Historians continue to debate many of the details we'll touch on, and where that uncertainty exists, it will be named plainly rather than smoothed over. This is, after all, a history built largely from fragments. A broken oil lamp here, a papyrus fragment there, a few lines in a Roman legal text about curfews. From these fragments, though, a real picture does emerge, and it's one worth spending some quiet time with. If you find this kind of slow, evidence-based journey into the past helpful for winding down, you're welcome to subscribe to Bedtime Story Media. We build a new one of these most weeks, and it helps more than you'd think. For now, let's begin where the story of human night truly starts, not in a city, but around a small, carefully tended fire. Long before anyone built a wall, planted a field, or wrote a single word, one invention quietly rearranged how humans experienced the hours after sunset. That invention was controlled fire. The archaeological record on this point is patchy but genuinely fascinating. Sites such as Wonderwork Cave in South Africa have produced burned bone and ash that some researchers date to roughly 1 million years ago, suggesting that early hominins, likely Homo erectus, were already making some use of fire long before our own species existed. Evidence for truly regular, controlled use, fire tended deliberately, night after night, rather than opportunistically gathered from natural sources, becomes clearer from around 400,000 years onward at sites in the Middle East and Europe. Historians and archaeologists continue to debate the exact pace of this transition, since fire leaves inconsistent physical traces and natural wildfires can easily be mistaken for hearths. What is less disputed is what fire did once it became a nightly companion. Before it, darkness was simply darkness, a period in which humans, like most other daylight-adapted animals, were vulnerable, sight-limited, and largely inactive. Fire changed the terms of that arrangement. A small flame extended usable light for hours. It kept large predators at a distance. It allowed meat and plants to be cooked, which in turn appears to have influenced the nutritional and possibly even the physical development of early human groups over many generations. But fire's most significant contribution to night may have been social rather than practical. A hearth creates a natural gathering point. Unlike foraging or hunting, which tend to scatter a group across a landscape during the day, a fire at night pulls people inward into a shared light and warmth. Archaeologists studying hearth arrangements at various Paleolithic sites have noted something consistent. Artifacts, tools, and food debris tend to cluster tightly around these ancient hearth pits, suggesting that a great deal of daily life, eating, tool repair, perhaps early forms of storytelling or teaching, took place in that glow after the sun went down. Picture for a moment what an evening might have looked like at one of these early hearths, somewhere in what is now southern France or northern Africa, perhaps 300,000 years ago. The work of the day, gathering, hunting, moving camp, would be finished, or nearly so. As the light faded, family groups likely converged toward the fire, which someone, probably a specific individual with some responsibility for the task, had kept smoldering through the daylight hours using slow-burning wood or dung. The flames would have thrown long shadows against cave walls or rock shelters. The warmth would have been welcome, especially in the colder climates of Ice Age Europe, where nighttime temperatures could fall dramatically even in relatively temperate seasons. There is reasonable archaeological support for the idea that these fireside hours involved more than simple survival. Tools found near ancient hearths sometimes show signs of careful, unhurried craftsmanship, the kind of fine work that would have been difficult to justify during a busy hunting day, but which fits naturally into a slower evening routine. Some researchers have proposed that the invention of more complex symbolic behavior in early humans, ornamentation, pigment use, more elaborate tool-making, may be connected to this expansion of usable time that fire provided. This remains an ongoing research area rather than settled fact, but it's a compelling thread to sit with. Sleep itself would have looked different by this firelight than it does for most of us now.
Without walls, mattresses, or blankets in the modern sense, early humans likely slept in loose groups near the fire, using furs, dried grasses, or simple bedding of leaves and moss for warmth and comfort. Someone may have stayed semi-alert through parts of the night, tending the flame and watching for danger, a pattern of shared, staggered wakefulness that some anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have observed and suggested might echo much older habits. This idea, sometimes called segmented sleep, remains debated as a universal ancient pattern, but it offers a useful reminder that a single unbroken 8-hour night, of the kind many of us now expect, may not have been the norm for most of human history. As groups moved into caves and rock shelters for extended periods, the fires became more permanent fixtures of these dwellings. Excavations at sites in Israel and Spain reveal repeated hearth locations built up in layers over what may be thousands of years of intermittent use, evidence that particular groups returned again and again to the same sheltered spaces, tending fires in almost the same spot their ancestors once had. There's something quietly moving in that continuity, the idea that a family entering a cave 40,000 years ago might have settled beside the ash and stone remnants of a fire lit by people who lived long before them without ever knowing whose hands had lit it first. By the time modern humans had spread widely across Africa, Europe, and Asia, fire management became a defining feature of daily and nightly life. It shaped where people camped, how groups organized themselves after dark, and how the earliest forms of shared evening routine, eating together, working quietly, perhaps talking or teaching, took root. The fire did not simply provide light, it created the very possibility of a human night that was social rather than merely survived. Maintaining a fire through an entire night was not a simple or passive task, and it likely required real learned skill passed down within a group or family. Different types of wood burn at different rates, some producing long-lasting coals suitable for overnight use, others burning quickly and requiring frequent attention. Slower-burning hardwoods, where available, would have been especially valued for extending a fire through the darkest, coldest hours without constant tending. Someone within the group, possibly rotating the responsibility, would have needed to wake periodically through the night to add fuel, a task that connects naturally to the pattern of segmented, watchful sleep discussed earlier in this chapter. The physical arrangement of ancient hearths also tells us something about the social organization that likely surrounded them. Excavations at long-occupied sites sometimes reveal multiple hearths within a single dwelling area, suggesting that larger groups may have organized themselves into smaller family units, even while sharing a broader communal space, each cluster maintaining its own more intimate fire alongside a larger shared one. This pattern, while not universal across all sites, hints at a nuanced social structure already present deep in prehistory, one that balanced the practical benefits of a larger shared fire with the more intimate warmth and privacy of a smaller family hearth nearby.
Deep within certain limestone caves in what is now France and Spain, far past the point where daylight can reach, ancient painters left images of horses, bison, deer, and lions on the rock walls. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, these sites have become famous for their artistry, but they raise a quieter, more practical question that connects directly to our theme. How did anyone see well enough, this deep underground, to paint at all? The answer is fire in one of its more specialized ancient forms. Archaeologists excavating these painted chambers have recovered stone lamps, small, shallow bowls carved from limestone, some still holding residue of animal fat that would have served as fuel, with a simple wick, perhaps of juniper or moss.
These lamps produced a soft, flickering light, quite different from the brighter blaze of an open hearth. It would have been enough to work by, though only just, and the flickering itself may have added a particular quality to how the painted animals appeared to move across the uneven rock surface. Whether this cave art was created at night specifically, deep in darkness by necessity, or whether night as a separate concept even mattered once someone was already sealed away from daylight in a deep chamber, is genuinely difficult to know. Researchers point out that inside a deep cave system, time of day on the surface becomes almost irrelevant. The environment is dark regardless of the hour. What we can say with more confidence is that this act, carrying fire deliberately into darkness in order to create something, represents an early and striking example of humans using controlled light not just to survive the night, but to extend what was possible within it. Some archaeologists have proposed, cautiously, that certain painted chambers may have served ceremonial or ritual purposes, perhaps associated with rites of passage, seasonal gatherings, or shared belief systems now lost to us. This interpretation remains debated, and it would be inaccurate to present it as a settled fact. Alternative explanations include territorial marking, storytelling, or simple artistic expression without any ritual dimension at all. What the evidence does show clearly is the deliberate, repeated, and skilled use of artificial light to work within total darkness, a practice that would have required real planning, gathering fuel in advance, carrying it into the cave, managing the flame carefully enough to avoid smoke damage to the eyes or to the very art being created. Outside these ceremonial or artistic spaces, evidence suggests that most Paleolithic communities spent their ordinary nights closer to cave mouths or rock shelter openings, where natural light lingered longer and where smoke from cooking fires could escape more easily. These more everyday spaces show different patterns of use. Food remains, broken tools, worn stone surfaces suggesting repeated activity. This was where families likely settled for the night in a more routine sense, distinct from whatever deeper, more specialized activity occurred further inside certain caves. There's a useful lesson in holding these two spaces side by side. Ancient night was not one uniform experience, even within a single community. Some nights were ordinary, eating, resting, quiet conversation near a fire close to the cave entrance. Others, occasionally, involved venturing much further into darkness for reasons that may have combined the practical, the artistic, and the spiritual in ways we can only partly reconstruct today. What remains constant across both kinds of night is the evident comfort people took in managing darkness actively rather than simply enduring it. The stone lamps of Lascaux, carefully shaped and clearly reused many times based on wear patterns, suggest a group of people who had developed real expertise in producing reliable, portable light. A small technology, easily overlooked, that nonetheless allowed the human night to become a canvas rather than only a threat. Chemical analysis of residue found in some of these ancient lamps has allowed researchers to identify the specific fats used as fuel, most commonly derived from animals such as reindeer or other large game available to the artists at the time. This level of detail matters because it tells us these were not improvised one-time tools, but part of a considered, repeatable technology, understood well enough that a painter could reliably estimate how long a given lamp would burn and could plan a session of work accordingly. Some lamps show soot patterns, suggesting they were carried by hand, held close to the rock as the artist worked, while others, found with traces of wear along their edges, may have been set down and left burning on a ledge or in a niche, freeing both hands for the careful, patient work of applying pigment. It's worth remembering, too, that transporting a lit or even an unlit lamp deep into a cave system, sometimes hundreds of meters from the entrance, along uneven, unfamiliar ground, was itself no small undertaking. Whoever made that journey needed a reasonably clear mental map of the cave's interior, additional fuel or spare wicks in case the light failed part way, and enough confidence in the darkness to keep moving forward. This, too, speaks to a level of comfort and competence with managed darkness that feels worth appreciating quietly, this many thousands of years later.
For most of human history, night carried a particular kind of vulnerability that had nothing to do with fear in an emotional sense and everything to do with basic biology. Human eyesight, unlike that of many nocturnal predators, is not well suited to low light. Without artificial light sources, human night vision allows for only limited, blurred perception, especially in unfamiliar or uneven terrain. This simple fact shaped an enormous amount of ancient behavior after dark. Anthropologists studying both archaeological evidence and modern small-scale societies with limited artificial lighting have noted that many communities developed a heightened reliance on hearing during nighttime hours, quite naturally, as a way of compensating for reduced sight. A twig snapping at a certain distance, the particular rhythm of an animal's footfall, the changing pitch of wind moving through different types of vegetation, these auditory cues likely carried real practical weight for ancient people settling in for the night, whether in open savanna, dense forest, or rocky highland terrain. This reliance on sound may help explain why so many ancient settlements, from very early camps through to fortified Bronze Age towns, show evidence of deliberate boundary markers. Fences of thorn branches, stacked stone walls, ditches. Beyond their obvious defensive function against predators or rival groups, these boundaries may also have served an acoustic purpose, creating a threshold that, if crossed by something large enough, would produce a warning sound audible to those resting nearby. Some archaeologists studying enclosure sites in eastern and southern Africa have proposed this dual defensive and acoustic function, though the idea remains an interpretation rather than a documented certainty, since no written record survives to confirm ancient reasoning directly. Sleep itself, under these conditions, appears to have often involved a degree of shared vigilance. Ethnographic studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, used cautiously by historians as a possible, imperfect window into ancient patterns, have observed that individuals within a resting group often wake briefly and irregularly throughout the night, rather than sleeping in one continuous block. Different members of a group may be alert at different times, creating an informal rotating watch without anyone necessarily assigning it as a formal duty. Whether this pattern reflects deep ancient practice or is simply a feature of small group living in exposed environments remains an open question among researchers. As settlements grew larger and more permanent, moving from small family camps toward villages and eventually towns, the responsibility for nighttime vigilance appears to have become more structured. Later chapters in this documentary will look closely at formal night watches in Mesopotamian and Roman cities, but it's worth noting here that the underlying instinct, using sound and shared attentiveness to manage the reduced visibility of night, likely has very deep roots, stretching back long before any city wall was built. There is something worth sitting with in this picture of ancient night, a world in which darkness demanded a different kind of attention, not necessarily anxious, but alert in a quiet, practiced way.
People who lived this way for many, many generations likely developed real skill in reading the sounds of their particular landscape, distinguishing the ordinary rustle of nocturnal animals from something that genuinely warranted concern. It was less a state of constant fear than a kind of learned fluency, the same way a modern city dweller might unconsciously register the difference between ordinary traffic noise and something out of place. This heightened nighttime attentiveness likely extended to a group's sense of its own surrounding landscape more broadly. Familiarity with a particular territory, built up over seasons or years of repeated use, would have allowed ancient people to anticipate, at least in general terms, which sounds belonged to their environment and which did not. A river's steady flow, the particular call of a nocturnal bird common to the region, the wind moving through a familiar stand of trees, all of this would have formed a kind of background pattern against which anything unusual could be more readily noticed. Groups moving into unfamiliar territory, by contrast, likely faced a genuinely more demanding, more uncertain nighttime experience without this accumulated local knowledge to rely on, a consideration that may have shaped how cautiously and how quickly early human groups expanded into new regions. Some researchers studying the cognitive dimensions of ancient life have suggested that this nightly practice of careful listening and pattern recognition may have contributed over very long timescales to broader human cognitive development, sharpening skills in auditory discrimination and environmental awareness that would have carried practical value during daylight hours as well. This remains a speculative area of research rather than an established finding, but it offers a useful reminder that the skills ancient people developed to manage the night were not necessarily separate from their broader cognitive and survival toolkit. They were, in many respects, deeply woven into it.
Once fire had made the night survivable and shared vigilance had made it manageable, something else began to happen for many ancient peoples. The night sky became genuinely useful. Long before formal astronomy existed as a discipline, careful observation of stars, the moon, and their predictable movements offered practical benefits that mattered to daily and seasonal life. The position of certain constellations at dusk could signal the approach of a particular season, useful information for a community planning when to move camp, when to expect migrating game, or later when to plant and harvest crops. The moon's phases offered a natural calendar, visible to everyone, requiring no instruments or specialized knowledge to track in a general way. Some of the oldest surviving evidence for this kind of observation comes from carved bone and ivory objects found at various Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe, marked with series of notches that some researchers have interpreted as lunar tally marks, a simple record of the moon's changing phases kept over weeks or months. This interpretation remains debated among archaeologists. The notches could alternatively represent other kinds of counting, unrelated to the moon. Still, the possibility is intriguing, suggesting that some ancient peoples may have been quietly tracking the night sky's rhythms tens of thousands of years before the invention of writing. By the time more settled agricultural societies emerged several thousand years later, this kind of observation had become considerably more organized in certain cultures. Structures such as Newgrange in Ireland, built roughly 5,000 years ago, appear to have been deliberately aligned so that sunlight enters a long passage only around the winter solstice, illuminating an inner chamber briefly each year. While this particular alignment concerns dawn rather than deep night, its construction required extensive nighttime observation over multiple years to correctly calculate the solstice timing, work that would have depended on people watching the horizon carefully across many long nights. In Mesopotamia, a region we'll return to in more depth shortly, careful nighttime sky watching eventually developed into one of the ancient world's most sophisticated intellectual traditions.
Babylonian scholars working from rooftop observation platforms in cities such as Babylon and Uruk kept remarkably detailed written records of planetary movements, eclipses, and star positions over centuries, some of the earliest sustained scientific record-keeping known to survive from the ancient world. These observations combined practical utility, supporting agricultural calendars and religious timing, with deeply held beliefs connecting celestial events to the will or activity of particular gods. Historians studying these records are careful to separate the genuinely impressive observational and mathematical achievement from the belief system surrounding it, noting that both existed together without apparent contradiction for the people involved. For ordinary people, without access to formal training or rooftop observatories, the night sky likely offered something gentler, simple orientation and quiet company. Sailors navigating coastal waters used recognizable star patterns to hold a steady course after sunset, a practice we'll return to later in this documentary. Shepherds watching flocks through the night, farmers waiting out a long harvest evening, travelers resting beside a road, all shared access to the same unobstructed sky, largely undimmed by artificial light of any kind, that we now associate mainly with remote wilderness. It is worth remembering that for nearly all of human history, this brilliant star-filled sky was not a rare experience reserved for astronomers. It was simply what night looked like for everyone, every clear evening, everywhere on Earth. This shared visibility may have contributed to how widespread certain cultural practices around the night sky became, independently, across cultures with no contact with one another. Star-based mythology, constellations imagined as animals, heroes, or household objects, and calendar systems tied to lunar or stellar cycles appear in societies from ancient China to Polynesia to the Americas, each developing its own distinct interpretations from the same physical sky. The stars, in this sense, were one of the very few genuinely universal features of ancient night, equally visible and equally mysterious to a fisherman on the Nile, a herder on the Mongolian steppe, and a farmer in the Andes. Beyond calendars and navigation, the night sky may have also played a quieter, more personal role in ancient life, offering a kind of stability and predictability that few other aspects of ancient existence could match. Harvests could fail, health could falter, political circumstances could shift unpredictably, but the stars, as far as ancient observers could tell, followed the same patterns night after night, year after year, a reliability that some historians studying ancient religious thought have suggested may have contributed to the widespread association with celestial bodies and concepts of permanence, order, or divine will. This connection between astronomical regularity and religious or philosophical meaning appears, in various forms, across an enormous range of ancient cultures, from Mesopotamian celestial divination to later Greek philosophical traditions that treated the heavens as a model of perfect, unchanging order. For children in many ancient communities, evidence suggests the night sky likely also served a more straightforward purpose, simple wonder and early education, delivered informally by parents or elders, pointing out familiar shapes and patterns, teaching names and associated stories passed down through oral tradition. This kind of quiet, low-stakes evening instruction, sitting together and looking upward, connects naturally to the broader theme of evening storytelling this documentary will explore in more depth later. Another example of how ancient night served not only practical and religious purposes, but simple, gentle, familial connection.
By around 3,000 years before the Common Era, cities had emerged along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the region historians call Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. Places like Uruk, and later Babylon, represented something genuinely new in human experience. Dense, permanent urban settlements, home to thousands of people living in close proximity, governed by written law, organized religion, and complex trade networks. Night in these cities looked very different from night in a small farming village or an open camp, and the differences reveal a great deal about how urban life reshaped the human relationship with darkness. Consider a composite figure historians might reconstruct from available evidence, a night watchman patrolling the mud brick wall of Ur sometime around 2000 BCE. This is not a specific recorded individual, but a representative figure, built from what archaeology and surviving administrative texts tell us about how such cities managed nighttime security. His work would have begun at dusk, when the great wooden city gates, reinforced with bronze fittings, according to some surviving records, were closed and barred for the night. Clay tablets recovered from Mesopotamian archives, primarily administrative and legal in nature, mention gatekeepers and night guards as established civic roles, suggesting that securing the city after dark was considered important enough to be formalized and evidently to pay for. Walking the wall through the night hours, our watchman would have carried a small oil lamp, simple in construction, a shallow ceramic bowl holding sesame oil with a twisted linen wick. These lamps, examples of which have survived in considerable numbers from Mesopotamian sites, produced a modest, flickering light, enough to check a locked gate or notice movement nearby, though certainly not enough to illuminate any real distance. Between patrol points, much of his watch would have been spent in near total darkness, relying, much like his distant ancestors around Ice Age hearths, primarily on hearing rather than sight. Within the city walls, most ordinary households would have settled for the night not long after sunset, a pattern driven largely by the practical cost and scarcity of lamp oil, which was not cheap and was not used carelessly. Archaeological evidence from residential quarters in cities like Ur suggests small, simple homes, often centered around an interior courtyard, where families would gather for a final meal before retiring to sleeping areas, sometimes on raised platforms or simple woven mats arranged for warmth and modest comfort. Not every part of the city fell silent, however. Surviving Mesopotamian texts describe temple complexes maintaining nighttime rituals and vigils, particularly connected to specific religious festivals tied to the lunar calendar. According to religious tradition of the time, certain deities were believed to be especially attentive or active during particular night hours, and priests maintained watches accordingly, tending sacred lamps that were, by religious custom, never permitted to go out. This practice reflects the deep integration of religious belief into nearly every aspect of Mesopotamian daily and nightly life, though our understanding of the specific rituals involved comes from fragmentary texts, and many details remain genuinely uncertain to historians today. Beyond religious observance, some administrative and commercial activity likely continued into the evening hours as well. Surviving cuneiform records include occasional references to transactions and deliveries associated with evening timing, suggesting that in a city of this size and complexity, economic life did not stop entirely at sunset, even if it slowed considerably compared to daytime hours. Dreams held particular significance in Mesopotamian culture, closely tied both to religious belief and early medical thinking. Surviving texts, including what scholars sometimes call dream omen compendiums, catalog various dream images and their supposed meanings, treating dreams as potentially meaningful messages, sometimes from the gods, sometimes as signs of physical or emotional imbalance. This tradition, which we'll explore in more depth in a later chapter, illustrates how seriously ancient Mesopotamians took the night, not merely as a period of rest, but as a time during which meaningful, even sacred experience might occur.
By the time a Mesopotamian city's watchman completed his rounds and the eastern sky began to lighten, the Mesopotamian city gates would be reopened, allowing farmers, merchants, and travelers waiting outside to enter for the day's business. Night, in this sense, functioned almost as a held breath for the entire community, a controlled, carefully managed pause between one busy day and the next, bounded by walls, gates, and the steady, patient watch of people whose names, in nearly every case, history has not preserved. Surviving legal codes from Mesopotamia, including sections of the well-known laws attributed to Hammurabi, offer indirect but telling evidence of how seriously nighttime security was regarded in these societies. Certain provisions address theft and property damage occurring after dark with particular severity, suggesting that nighttime crime was recognized as a distinct category of concern, perhaps because reduced visibility made both the commission and the detection of such acts meaningfully different from equivalent daytime offenses. Other administrative texts record penalties or consequences for watchmen found derelict in their duties, indicating that the role, while perhaps modest in social status, carried real accountability. Life for our composite watchman, walking his rounds along Ur's mud brick wall, would have varied considerably by season. Summer nights in Mesopotamia, while still requiring vigilance, at least offered relatively mild temperatures for extended outdoor watch duty. Winter nights, by contrast, particularly in the early morning hours before dawn, could turn genuinely cold, and watchmen likely relied on simple woolen cloaks and, where the patrol route allowed, brief periods near a sheltered brazier to stay warm enough to remain alert through a long, difficult shift. The physical discomfort of this work, rarely mentioned directly in surviving records, is nonetheless implied by the practical realities of standing watch through an unheated Mesopotamian winter night, a detail worth remembering when considering the quieter, less celebrated forms of labor that kept ancient cities functioning.
Along the banks of the Nile, ancient Egyptian communities developed their own distinctive relationship with darkness, shaped by the region's climate, its religious cosmology, and the rhythms of the river itself. Consider another composite figure, an elder woman managing a modest household in a village near Thebes, sometime during the New Kingdom period, roughly 1300 BCE. Her evening, reconstructed from tomb paintings, household artifacts, and surviving texts, would have followed a fairly consistent seasonal rhythm. As the intense daytime heat of the Egyptian climate began to ease with the setting sun, household activity would typically increase rather than wind down immediately, a pattern noted by historians studying Egyptian daily life. Cooking, often done in an open courtyard to manage smoke and heat, might well have been an evening task, with the main family meal eaten after the worst of the day's heat had passed. Archaeological evidence from village sites, such as Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs, includes numerous small clay lamps, along with wicks and traces of animal fat or plant oil used for fuel, confirming that artificial light was a normal, if modest, feature of ordinary household evenings. Egyptian religious belief placed considerable emphasis on the night as a time of cosmic significance, tied to the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld, a rich mythological tradition recorded extensively in tomb texts such as the Amduat and the Book of Gates. According to this tradition, the sun, personified as the god Ra, traveled each night through 12 hours of the underworld, facing various trials and dangers, including the great serpent Apep, before emerging renewed at dawn.
It's important to note that this was religious cosmology, not something ancient Egyptians treated as literal, verifiable history in the modern sense. Rather, it represented a shared belief system that gave cosmic meaning to the daily disappearance and return of the sun, and, by extension, to the human experience of night and morning as well. For ordinary households, this cosmology likely translated into a general sense that night carried real spiritual weight, a period during which protective measures, both practical and religious, were worth taking seriously. Archaeologists have recovered numerous small protective amulets from Egyptian domestic sites, some specifically associated with nighttime safety and peaceful sleep, including figures of household deities such as Bes, a protective god, particularly associated with guarding sleeping families, especially children, from harm during the night. Small lamps, statuettes, and inscribed objects found near sleeping areas in excavated homes suggest that Egyptian families took active, tangible steps to feel secure through the night, blending practical comfort with religious protection. Sleeping arrangements in Egyptian households, based on archaeological remains and tomb depictions, appear to have varied considerably by social class. Wealthier households might use raised wooden bed frames, sometimes elegantly carved, with woven supports and cushioned headrests, a distinctive Egyptian innovation, typically made of wood, stone, or ivory, shaped to support the neck rather than the whole head. This design, which might seem uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, likely offered practical benefits in Egypt's climate, keeping the head elevated and cooler, while also protecting elaborate hairstyles or head coverings from being disturbed during sleep. Poorer households, more common by far, likely slept on simple mats or low platforms, a pattern consistent with archaeological findings across most of the ancient world. Beyond individual households, Egyptian temples maintained their own significant nighttime religious activity, echoing patterns we've already seen in Mesopotamia, though shaped by distinctly Egyptian beliefs. Temple complexes employed priests specifically responsible for nighttime rituals, tending sacred lamps and performing ceremonies tied to particular religious calendars. Some temple inscriptions describe rituals intended to symbolically assist the sun god's nightly journey, reflecting the belief that human religious observance played some role in maintaining cosmic order, a concept ancient Egyptians called Ma'at. For the river itself, night brought its own particular rhythm. Fishermen working the Nile sometimes preferred nighttime hours for certain types of fishing, taking advantage of cooler temperatures and specific fish behaviors, using simple boats and nets under starlight, occasionally supplemented by torches to attract fish toward the surface, a technique documented in several tomb paintings depicting nighttime river scenes. This image, a small boat moving quietly across dark water beneath an enormous, star-filled Egyptian sky, offers a gentle human counterpoint to the grand cosmic mythology of Ra's underworld journey happening, according to belief, somewhere far beneath that same river and sky. Egyptian households also appear to maintain fairly consistent evening routines connected to hygiene and preparation for sleep, based on evidence from surviving cosmetic containers, small implements, and depictions found in tomb art. Wealthier households, in particular, seem to have valued a degree of evening grooming and preparation, with surviving artifacts including small stone or ceramic jars that once held scented oils or ointments, likely applied before sleep both for comfort in the region's dry climate and, according to some interpretations, for religious or protective purposes tied to the household deities discussed above. For less wealthy households, evening preparation was likely simpler, though the basic pattern of concluding the day's activity with some form of washing or settling routine before finally lying down to rest appeared to have been broadly consistent across social classes. Village life along smaller stretches of the Nile, away from the grander royal and temple centers, likely followed its own distinct evening pattern, shaped closely by the agricultural calendar. During the annual flooding season, when the Nile's waters rose and temporarily halted most farming activity, evening hours might have offered rural communities more available leisure time than during the demanding planting and harvest periods that followed the flood's recession. This seasonal rhythm, unique to the Nile Valley's particular agricultural cycle, would have shaped not only daytime labor, but the character and availability of evening rest and social time as well, a reminder that ancient night was never entirely separate from the broader agricultural and environmental rhythms governing daily life.
Having looked closely at two major river civilizations, it's worth pausing to consider a more intimate question that threads through nearly every culture we've discussed so far. What did ancient sleep itself actually look like, physically? Where and how did people lie down at the end of the day across different regions and levels of wealth? The evidence, gathered from archaeology, tomb art, and surviving texts, suggests enormous variety, shaped heavily by climate, available materials, and social status, but with certain recurring patterns worth noting. In many parts of the ancient world, particularly among less wealthy households, sleeping directly on the ground, cushioned by simple mats woven from reeds, straw, or animal hides, remained common for a very long time, indeed for most of human history in most places. This is not a sign of hardship exactly, so much as a reflection of what materials were locally available and affordable. Raised sleeping platforms and true beds elevated off the ground appear earlier and more consistently among wealthier households across several ancient cultures. In Egypt, as discussed, wooden bed frames with woven supports and neck rests appear in tombs and household remains from wealthier families. In Mesopotamia, surviving texts and depictions suggest similar wooden bed frames existed, sometimes elaborately carved, alongside simpler mat-based sleeping arrangements in more modest homes. The Minoan civilization on Crete, flourishing around 2000 to 1450 BCE, has left archaeological evidence of built-in stone or plaster sleeping platforms in some households, suggesting yet another regional variation on the same basic need. Temperature management appears to have been a significant, practical concern shaping ancient sleeping arrangements everywhere. In colder regions and seasons, sleeping close together, whether as a nuclear family or a larger extended household, offered obvious warmth benefits, a pattern likely stretching back, as discussed earlier, to the shared hearths of Paleolithic camps. Animal hides, woven wool blankets, and later linen or cotton textiles all served to retain body heat through cold nights, with wealthier households naturally able to afford thicker, more elaborate bedding materials. In warmer climates, particularly in Egypt and much of the Mediterranean and Near East during summer months, the opposite challenge applied, keeping cool enough to sleep comfortably. Some households, evidence suggests, may have slept on rooftops during particularly hot periods, taking advantage of cooler night air and any available breeze, a practice that continued in various forms across the Mediterranean and Near East for thousands of years, well beyond the specific civilizations covered in this documentary. Privacy, in the modern sense of individual bedrooms, was largely a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even then, not always prioritized in the way it might be today. Most ordinary households, across nearly every ancient culture examined by historians, involved shared sleeping spaces, entire families, sometimes spanning multiple generations, resting within a single room or a small number of rooms. This pattern reflects both practical space constraints and, quite likely, a different cultural relationship with privacy and personal space than many people are accustomed to today,
one shaped by close-knit family structures and shared responsibility for household security through the night. Children's sleeping arrangements varied as well, though evidence remains genuinely limited on this specific point compared to adult sleeping patterns. Some households likely kept infants and very young children close to parents through the night for warmth, comfort, and practical caretaking reasons, a pattern anthropologists studying traditional societies note as common across many cultures, historically and even today. As children grew older, they might have transitioned to shared sleeping spaces with siblings, though specific evidence on this transition from ancient sources remains fragmentary. What emerges from this broader look at ancient sleeping arrangements is less a single universal pattern than a set of shared underlying concerns addressed differently depending on local resources and climate. Staying warm or cool as needed, staying reasonably comfortable on available materials, and very often staying close to family for both practical and emotional reasons. These concerns, in their essence, feel remarkably familiar even now, separated from these ancient households by many thousands of years. Pillows and headrests, in one form or another, appear across a striking range of ancient cultures, though their specific form varied considerably. Beyond the carved wooden and stone headrests already mentioned in Egypt, similar devices appear in ancient China, where lacquered wood or ceramic headrests have been recovered from various archaeological contexts, and in parts of Mesopotamia, where simpler cushioned supports, likely stuffed with wool or plant material, seem to have served a comparable function for households that could afford them. The consistent appearance of some kind of head support across cultures with no direct contact suggests a shared practical recognition that comfortable, supported sleep mattered enough to invest real craftsmanship in solving the problem, even if the specific solutions differed considerably by region and material. Textile production more broadly played a significant, often underappreciated role in ancient sleeping comfort. Archaeological evidence, along with surviving textual references to household inventories in various ancient cultures, suggests that woven blankets, coverings, and bedding materials represented genuinely valuable household possessions, sometimes specifically mentioned in inheritance records or dowry lists, indicating their real economic and practical importance. Producing these textiles required significant labor, spinning fiber, weaving cloth, sometimes dyeing material for both function and modest decoration, work that in many ancient households fell primarily to women, whose evening hours, in addition to any storytelling or rest, likely often included this kind of ongoing textile labor, sometimes continued by lamplight after the day's other tasks were complete.
Not every part of ancient urban life paused entirely at sunset. In certain cities, at certain periods, evidence suggests that some commercial and market activity continued into the evening hours, adapting to cooler temperatures and different rhythms of urban life. This pattern appears most clearly documented in later periods and in warmer climates, where daytime heat made evening or nighttime activity genuinely more comfortable and practical for both merchants and customers. In parts of the Roman world, which we'll explore in more depth in a later chapter, certain deliveries and transport activities were legally required to occur only at night, specifically because daytime cart and wagon traffic was restricted within crowded city streets, a regulation recorded in surviving Roman municipal law. This created, somewhat incidentally, a genuine nighttime commercial rhythm in cities like Rome itself, with the sounds of wooden cartwheels on stone streets becoming, according to surviving complaints from Roman writers, a notable feature of the Roman urban night, not always a welcome one for those trying to sleep nearby. Earlier civilizations show more limited but still meaningful evidence of evening commercial activity.
Mesopotamian administrative texts occasionally reference transactions with evening timing, though whether this reflects genuine after-dark trading or simply late afternoon business recorded using evening terminology remains somewhat unclear to historians working with these fragmentary records. Evidence from Egyptian sources is similarly limited on this specific point, though the general pattern of household and small-scale craft activity continuing into cooler evening hours, discussed in the previous chapter on Egyptian nightfall, suggests that at least some economic activity did extend past sunset in various forms. Port cities, in particular, across many ancient cultures, likely experienced distinctive nighttime commercial patterns tied to shipping schedules, tides, and the practical realities of loading and unloading cargo vessels. Ships arriving after dark, whether due to weather delays or simply the length of a voyage, would have required at least some nighttime dock activity to receive and secure cargo, even if full commercial transactions waited until daylight. This pattern would have applied across trading networks from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, wherever maritime trade formed a significant part of a city's economy. Bakeries represent one particularly well-documented example of genuine nighttime economic activity in the ancient world, and one that connects directly to a very human, very relatable rhythm still familiar today. Bread, in many ancient cultures, needed to be baked early, well before the main meals of the day, in order to be fresh and available when needed. Archaeological evidence from Roman Pompeii, remarkably well preserved due to the volcanic eruption that buried the city, includes bakeries with large stone ovens showing clear evidence of very early pre-dawn use, work that would have begun in the deep hours of the night in order to have bread ready by early morning. This is a pattern that, in modified form, persists in bakeries around the world even now, a genuinely ancient rhythm that has simply never gone away. Metalworking and certain other craft trades also occasionally required or benefited from nighttime conditions, according to evidence from various ancient sites. Some smelting and forging processes ancient metallurgists appear to have discovered through practical experience allowed better visual assessment of metal temperature and color in darker conditions than in bright daylight, since the glow of heated metal is considerably easier to judge accurately against a dark background. Whether this practical consideration routinely pushed metalworking into full nighttime hours, or simply meant certain critical steps were performed in shaded or enclosed workshop conditions, regardless of the actual time of day, remains somewhat unclear from available evidence, though the underlying principle that darkness could serve a genuine technical purpose for skilled craftspeople is a detail worth appreciating. Certain religious festivals across various ancient cultures also incorporated genuine nighttime commercial activity, as temporary markets and vendors gathered to serve crowds attending nighttime processions, vigils, or celebrations discussed in earlier chapters. These occasional, festival-linked nighttime markets likely offered a considerably livelier, more celebratory atmosphere than the routine, practical evening commerce of ordinary bakeries and dock deliveries, combining genuine economic activity with the social and religious energy of a significant community gathering, illuminated by whatever combination of torches, lamps, and festival fires the occasion called for. Taken together, this evidence suggests that while the majority of ordinary ancient people did rest through most of the night, urban life, particularly in larger, more complex cities, was rarely completely silent after dark. Certain trades, certain deliveries, certain essential preparations continued quietly through the night hours, carried out by people whose work, much like the night watchmen discussed earlier, kept the city functioning while most of their neighbors slept.
We've already met one composite figure standing watch on the walls of ancient Ur.
it's worth taking a fuller, more comparative look at how different ancient societies organized the essential, often overlooked work of nighttime security, since this responsibility appears in one form or another across nearly every settled civilization examined by historians. In Mesopotamian cities, as discussed, surviving administrative texts confirm the existence of formal gatekeeper and watchman roles, apparently compensated positions within the civic structure, responsible for securing city gates and patrolling walls through the night. These roles likely carried genuine social importance, given the significant investment ancient cities made in their defensive walls in the first place. A wall was only as effective as the vigilance of those guarding its gates after dark. Egyptian evidence for formal night watch structures is somewhat less directly documented in surviving texts, though tomb paintings and administrative records suggest that temple complexes, royal palaces, and important storage facilities, particularly granaries holding the kingdom's grain reserves, maintained dedicated nighttime security. Given the central importance of grain storage to Egyptian economic and political stability, protecting these facilities through the night would have carried real practical weight. The clearest, most extensively documented ancient night watch system comes from Rome, particularly following reforms introduced under the Emperor Augustus around the turn of the 1st century. Prior to these reforms, Rome had relied on a fairly informal system of nighttime security, apparently inadequate for a city that had grown to enormous size and density. Augustus established the Vigils, an organized force with responsibilities spanning both firefighting and general night security, divided among the city's districts and operating specifically through the night hours, when Rome's notorious fire risk, driven by densely packed wooden-framed apartment buildings called insulae, was considered most dangerous. Surviving Roman sources describe the vigils patrolling assigned routes through the city, watching for fires, which could spread with devastating speed through Rome's crowded neighborhoods, while also serving a general policing function, addressing theft, disturbances, and other nighttime disorder. This represents a notably more formalized, institutionalized approach to nighttime security than seen in earlier civilizations, reflecting Rome's scale and administrative sophistication, though it's worth noting that historians debate exactly how effective the vigils were in practice, since surviving Roman literature includes plenty of complaints about ongoing nighttime crime and disorder despite their presence. Beyond these major, well-documented examples, smaller settlements across the ancient world likely relied on more informal arrangements, perhaps rotating responsibility among household heads or community members, echoing the shared, informal vigilance patterns discussed earlier in the context of Paleolithic camps. Village life, without the resources to maintain a dedicated professional watch force, probably depended more on collective awareness, closely spaced dwellings, and the kind of acoustic vigilance discussed in an earlier chapter than on any formal patrol system. What unites all of these examples, from the mud-brick walls of Ur to the crowded streets of Augustan Rome, is a consistent recognition that the reduced visibility and increased vulnerability of night required deliberate, organized human effort to manage safely. This work, whether performed by a paid Roman fire watcher or an unnamed Mesopotamian gatekeeper, represents one of ancient society's most essential and least celebrated forms of labor, the quiet, unglamorous task of staying awake and alert so that everyone else could safely sleep. It's worth considering briefly what daily life looked like for someone holding this kind of role over an extended period. Night watch work, by its very nature, required an inverted schedule relative to most of the surrounding community, sleeping through some portion of daylight hours in order to remain alert through the night.
This kind of schedule, historians studying similar roles in later periods have noted, likely carried its own particular social experience, a degree of separation from ordinary daytime community rhythms and gatherings, even while the watchman's work remained absolutely essential to that same community's safety and functioning. Whether ancient societies developed any particular social recognition or status associated with this inverted rhythm, distinct from other forms of labor, remains genuinely unclear from surviving evidence, though the practical challenge seems a reasonable one to imagine. Different cultures also appear to have developed different technological aids to support nighttime watch duties, beyond the simple oil lamps already discussed. Some evidence suggests the use of trained dogs in various ancient watch contexts, valued for their superior hearing and sense of smell compared to human capabilities, offering an additional layer of environmental awareness, particularly useful during the quieter, more monotonous stretches of a long night watch. This practical partnership between humans and dogs for nighttime security purposes appears to have quite deep roots, potentially stretching back even further than most of the specific civilizations discussed in this documentary, given the very early domestication of dogs in human history.
Across nearly every ancient culture examined by historians, dreams held significance well beyond simple biological curiosity. They were treated, in various forms, as meaningful experiences, sometimes divine communication, sometimes diagnostic information about a person's physical or emotional state. And this treatment reveals something genuinely interesting about how ancient people understood the mind and its relationship to the night. In Mesopotamia, surviving texts, sometimes referred to by modern scholars as dream omen compendiums, catalog specific dream images alongside interpreted meanings, treating dream interpretation as a genuine, systematic area of specialized knowledge, not unlike medicine or astrology in its perceived seriousness. According to these ancient beliefs, dreams could carry messages from particular deities, warnings about future events, or diagnostic insight into physical ailments. Professional dream interpreters, evidence suggests, held recognized social positions, consulted by individuals seeking to understand particularly vivid or troubling dreams. Egyptian tradition similarly treated dreams as potentially significant, sometimes divine in origin. Surviving papyrus texts, including what scholars call dream books, list various dream contents alongside interpretations, following patterns broadly similar to Mesopotamian practice, though shaped by distinctly Egyptian religious and cultural context. Certain temples, according to some evidence, may have practiced a form of dream incubation, where individuals would sleep within sacred spaces, specifically hoping to receive meaningful, sometimes healing dreams, believed to come through divine intervention. This practice, sometimes called incubation by modern scholars borrowing later Greek terminology, appears in various forms across several ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures, suggesting a widely shared, if independently developed, belief in the sacred potential of dream experience. Greek tradition, somewhat later chronologically but worth mentioning briefly for comparative context, developed extensive dream incubation practices, particularly associated with healing sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Patients seeking healing would sleep within these sanctuary complexes, hoping to receive a dream in which the god himself, according to belief, would provide guidance or direct healing. This practice illustrates how closely ancient cultures often linked sleep, dreams, and physical or spiritual healing, treating the vulnerable unconscious state of sleep as an opening through which meaningful, even therapeutic experience might occur. It's worth pausing to note what historians can and cannot confidently say about these practices. We have reasonably good textual evidence for what ancient people believed about dreams and how they interpreted them.
We have much less certain evidence about the actual subjective experience of dreaming in the ancient world, since no ancient source can tell us, in the way modern sleep science might, precisely what was happening physiologically during these interpreted dream states. What we can say is that dreams mattered deeply to how ancient people made sense of their nights, treated as neither random nor meaningless, but as a continuation, in altered form, of the same search for order, guidance, and meaning that shaped so much of ancient religious and intellectual life more broadly. This treatment of dreams as significant, worth recording, interpreting, and sometimes actively seeping out through practices like incubation adds another dimension to the picture of ancient night this documentary has been building. Night was not simply a period of reduced activity to be passively endured until morning. For many ancient people, it held its own distinct kind of potential, a space in which something meaningful, personal, or even sacred might unfold, quite apart from anything happening in the waking, daylight world. Beyond formal interpretation traditions maintained by specialists, evidence suggests that ordinary households across various ancient cultures also engaged with dreams in more everyday, informal ways, discussing particularly vivid or memorable dreams within the family, sometimes seeking simple reassurance or shared interpretation from an elder or trusted relative rather than a professional dream interpreter. This more informal, domestic engagement with dream experience, while less thoroughly documented in surviving texts than the specialized traditions of temple-based interpreters, likely represented the more common, day-to-day way most ancient people actually related to their own dream experience, woven into ordinary family conversation rather than formal religious consultation. Some ancient medical traditions also drew connections between dreams and physical health in ways that anticipate, in a very general sense, certain later medical thinking about the relationship between sleep and well-being. Mesopotamian medical texts, alongside the dream omen material already discussed, occasionally reference disturbed or unusual sleep patterns as potential symptoms worth noting alongside other physical complaints, suggesting an early, if quite different, recognition that sleep quality and overall health were meaningfully connected. This connection, drawn through a very different conceptual framework than modern medicine uses, nonetheless reflects a genuine, careful attention to sleep and its disturbances as something worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as simply incidental to a person's waking health and functioning. While dream interpreters and temple priests occupied themselves with the sacred and symbolic dimensions of ancient night, a great many other people were simply working, their labor shaped by practical necessity rather than religious belief. We've already touched briefly on bakers, whose pre-dawn labor at sites like Pompeii represents one of the clearest, most physically documented examples of ancient night work. Consider this labor in a bit more detail. A baker in a Roman provincial town, rising well before first light, tending a large stone oven that needed considerable time to reach proper baking temperature, kneading dough that had likely been left to rise overnight, timing the entire process so that fresh bread would be ready for customers arriving at dawn. This work required real skill, considerable physical effort, and a willingness to keep an inverted schedule relative to most of the surrounding community, a pattern of labor that, again, has never really disappeared from human life. Fishermen, as discussed in the context of the Nile, represent another significant category of ancient night workers, though their reasons for working after dark varied by region and by the specific type of fishing involved. In some contexts, particular fish species were more active or easier to catch during nighttime hours, making night fishing a practical choice rather than a necessity born of scheduling constraints. In coastal Mediterranean communities, evidence from various periods suggests fishermen sometimes used torches or fire baskets mounted on their boats specifically to attract fish toward the surface at night, a technique requiring real skill in managing fire safely aboard a small wooden vessel on open water. Shepherds and herders represent a further significant category of ancient night labor, one deeply tied to agricultural and pastoral life across many cultures. Flocks required protection through the night from predators, and in regions with limited enclosed grazing land, this often meant shepherds remaining with their animals overnight in open or semi-open terrain rather than in the relative safety and comfort of a village. This tradition appears across an enormous span of ancient cultures, from the pastoral communities of the ancient Near East to the herding societies of the Eurasian steppe, and it required considerable skill in managing both animals and personal safety through long, often solitary night hours. Beyond these major categories, evidence suggests various other essential night labor across ancient societies. Those responsible for maintaining sacred temple flames, discussed in earlier chapters, worked through the night by religious necessity. Certain craft specialists, particularly those working with materials or processes sensitive to daytime heat, may have preferred cooler evening hours for specific tasks. And in agricultural communities during harvest season, evidence suggests that time-sensitive tasks, such as bringing in crops ahead of anticipated weather changes, sometimes extended work well past sunset, using whatever moonlight or torchlight was available. What connects all of these examples is a recognition that ancient economies, much like modern ones, could not always neatly confine essential labor to daylight hours alone. Some tasks were simply better suited to night, whether for practical, biological, or safety-related reasons. This night labor, largely invisible in most historical accounts, which tend to focus on more prominent political or religious activity, nevertheless represents a significant and consistent thread running through ancient daily life, carried out by ordinary working people whose individual names have almost entirely been lost to time, but whose collective labor kept ancient communities fed, protected, and functioning. Midwifery represents another significant, if understandably unpredictable, category of ancient night labor worth mentioning, since childbirth, then as now, followed its own timing regardless of the hour. Evidence from various ancient cultures, including Egyptian medical papyri and later Greek and Roman sources, indicates that midwives held recognized, valued roles within their communities, and their work necessarily included readiness to respond at any hour, day or night. A midwife, roused from sleep to attend a birth in the deep hours of the night, would have needed to work carefully by whatever lamplight was available, drawing on practical knowledge passed down through experience, and, in some cultures, more formal instruction. Managing a genuinely high-stakes situation under far more difficult lighting conditions than daytime attendants would have offered. Mining and quarrying operations in certain ancient contexts also appear to have involved nighttime or continuous shift labor, particularly for time-sensitive or high-value extraction efforts. Some ancient mining sites, evidence suggests, operated under conditions requiring extended, sometimes around-the-clock labor, using oil lamps for illumination deep underground, where, much like the painted caves discussed earlier, natural light could not reach at all, regardless of the actual time of day on the surface above.
Not all of ancient night was devoted to labor, security, or religious observance. A gentler, more purely social use of evening hours appears consistently across cultures and periods. Storytelling, gathered around a fire or lamp, often involving multiple generations of a family or community together. This practice likely has extremely deep roots, connecting back to the earliest hearths discussed in this documentary's opening chapter. Anthropologists studying contemporary small-scale societies with limited artificial lighting have observed that evening hours, once daily labor concludes and darkness limits most other activity, frequently become dedicated storytelling time, a pattern some researchers suggest may reflect very ancient, deeply embedded human behavior, though it's worth being cautious about projecting modern observations too directly onto ancient contexts we cannot directly access. For ancient cultures with strong oral traditions, and this describes nearly all ancient societies to varying degrees, given that widespread literacy was rare until relatively recent history, evening storytelling likely served genuinely important social and educational functions well beyond simple entertainment. Elders passing down genealogies, historical narratives, moral teachings, and practical knowledge to younger generations would have relied heavily on repeated oral transmission, and evening hours, when the day's labor was finished and families or communities were naturally gathered together, offered a particularly suitable setting for this kind of sustained, attentive listening. Consider a composite figure worth imagining here, an elder in a small Mesopotamian or Levantine village sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, seated near the household fire as evening settles, surrounded by children and younger relatives finishing their evening meal. This figure, again a representative reconstruction rather than a specific recorded individual, might recount stories of the community's ancestors, explain the origins of local customs, or relate portions of larger cultural narratives, the kind of material that, in societies with writing, might eventually be recorded in texts like the Sumerian king list or various Near Eastern mythological cycles, but which for most of history existed primarily in spoken, memorized form, refined and transmitted across countless similar evening gatherings. Greek tradition offers a particularly well-documented, if somewhat later, example of this practice's cultural importance. The epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, existed for a considerable period as oral compositions performed by traveling poets before being fixed into the written form that survives today. Ancient sources describe these epic performances as significant social events, sometimes extending across multiple evenings, drawing audiences who would listen attentively for hours as extended narrative unfolded, accompanied by music in many cases. While these formal performances represent a more elaborate, professionalized version of storytelling than the small household gathering imagined above, they share the same underlying pattern: evening and night as a natural, favored setting for sustained narrative and shared listening. This storytelling tradition connects meaningfully to several themes already explored in this documentary. The reduced visual stimulation of night, discussed in the context of reliance on hearing over sight, may have made evening hours particularly well suited for purely auditory entertainment and instruction. The communal gathering around fire or lamp, established as a pattern stretching back to the earliest controlled use of fire, provided the natural physical setting, and the generally slower, less physically demanding pace of most evening hours compared to daytime labor offered the sustained attention that longer narratives require. It's a genuinely comforting thought in its own quiet way that across an enormous span of human history and geography, evening storytelling appears again and again as a favored, valued use of the hours after work concluded and before sleep began. Families and communities drawing closer together, sharing knowledge, memory, and imagination, precisely during the hours when the wider world outside their firelight had grown dark and still. Music, closely intertwined with oral storytelling traditions across many ancient cultures, likely played a significant role in these evening gatherings as well.
simple instruments reconstructed by archaeologists from surviving fragments, including flutes carved from bone found at various Paleolithic sites, along with later evidence of stringed instruments, drums, and percussion across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and other ancient cultures, suggest that evening gatherings often combined spoken narrative with musical accompaniment, creating a fuller, more immersive shared experience than words alone might have offered. Surviving Mesopotamian texts include references to specific songs and hymns performed in household and religious contexts, some evidently associated with evening or nighttime occasions, though the actual melodies, tragically, have not survived in any form we can reliably reconstruct. Games and riddles represent another gentle category of evening activity attested across various ancient cultures, offering a lighter counterpoint to more formal storytelling or religious observance. Board games, including examples like Senet in ancient Egypt and the royal game of in Mesopotamia, both well documented through surviving game boards and pieces recovered archaeologically, appear to have been popular evening pastimes across social classes, offering simple entertainment and social connection that required only modest lamplight to enjoy. Some interpretations suggest certain games carried additional religious or symbolic significance beyond simple entertainment, particularly in Egypt, where Senet appears in tomb contexts, suggesting some connection to beliefs about the afterlife journey, though the precise nature of this connection remains debated among scholars.
We've touched in earlier chapters on temple activity in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and on dream incubation practices tied to religious healing. It's worth taking a more focused look at the broader pattern of religious life specifically organized around nighttime hours, since this represents one of the more consistent, well-documented features of ancient religious practice across multiple cultures. Lunar cycles held particular religious significance in many ancient traditions, given the moon's visible, predictable, and dramatic presence in the night sky. Mesopotamian religious calendars incorporated specific rituals tied to particular lunar phases, according to surviving temple records, with the new moon in particular treated as a significant, often sacred transitional point, requiring specific ceremonial observance. Egyptian religious practice similarly incorporated lunar elements into certain festival calendars, alongside the solar-focused cosmology discussed earlier regarding Ra's nightly underworld journey. Vigil keeping, remaining deliberately awake through some or all of the night for religious purposes, appears as a recurring practice across several ancient traditions, though the specific reasoning and ritual details vary considerably by culture. In some contexts, evidence suggests vigils were connected to protecting or honoring sacred spaces during vulnerable nighttime hours. In others, they appear tied to specific festival calendars, marking significant seasonal or cosmological transitions, such as solstices or particular astronomical events. The broader pattern, an intentional, structured wakefulness during a period when most of the community rested, suggests that certain kinds of religious meaning were understood across multiple cultures to be specifically accessible or significant during night hours in a way that day hours were not. Sacred fire maintenance represents another consistent thread across several ancient religious traditions, connecting back to the fundamental importance of controlled fire established in this documentary's opening chapters. Beyond the Mesopotamian and Egyptian temple lamps already discussed, other ancient cultures maintained their own traditions of continuously tended sacred flames, requiring dedicated attendants working through the night specifically to prevent the flame's extinction, an outcome that, according to various religious traditions, could carry serious symbolic or even practical negative consequences for the community. It's worth noting, with appropriate historical caution, that our understanding of many specific ancient nighttime religious practices comes from fragmentary evidence,
partial texts, damaged inscriptions, archaeological remains that suggest ritual activity without fully explaining its meaning or procedure. Historians and archaeologists continue to debate many specific details, and it would be inaccurate to present reconstructed rituals with more confidence or completeness than the actual evidence supports. What remains reasonably well established across the fragmentary evidence available is the general pattern itself, that night held distinct religious significance in many ancient cultures, treated not merely as an absence of day, but as its own meaningful category of time, requiring its own specific forms of religious attention and observance. This pattern connects naturally to several other themes explored throughout this documentary, from the cosmic mythology of Ra's underworld journey to the significance placed on dreams as potentially sacred experience. Across these varied examples, a consistent thread emerges. Ancient peoples across an enormous range of cultures and periods generally did not treat night as religiously or spiritually empty. Quite the opposite, in fact. For many ancient traditions, the night held its own distinct sacred character, deserving of careful, deliberate attention from those responsible for maintaining a community's relationship with the divine. Funerary and mourning practices in various ancient cultures also incorporated distinct nighttime elements, worth mentioning briefly and with appropriate gentleness. Certain traditions, evidence suggests, favored nighttime or evening burial or mourning observances, sometimes tied to specific beliefs about the journey of the deceased into an afterlife, a journey some cultures conceived of beginning or proceeding during the vulnerable, liminal hours of night. Egyptian funerary practice, closely connected to the broader solar cosmology discussed earlier regarding Ra's nightly underworld journey, treated the transition into death and the afterlife as meaningfully parallel to the sun's own nightly passage through danger towards eventual renewal at dawn, a comforting symbolic framework that gave mourning families a broader cosmic narrative within which to situate their own loss. Household protective rituals, distinct from the larger temple-based observances already discussed, likely formed a significant, if less thoroughly documented, part of ordinary religious life connected to night. Small protective charms, inscribed amulets, and simple household rites intended to ward off misfortune or malevolent spiritual influences through the night appear across the archaeological record of numerous ancient cultures, suggesting that religious concern about the night's particular vulnerabilities extended well beyond formal temple institutions and into the daily, lived religious practice of ordinary families settling for the evening.
Rome, at its height, was home to perhaps 1 million people, an extraordinary concentration of humanity for the ancient world, and its nighttime character reflected this unprecedented urban scale in ways worth examining more closely than we've managed so far. As mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, Roman law restricted wheeled cart and wagon traffic within the city during daytime hours, a regulation attributed to Julius Caesar and apparently intended to reduce daytime congestion in Rome's famously crowded streets. The practical consequence of this law was a genuinely distinctive Roman nighttime soundscape, the clatter and rumble of cartwheels on stone paving, continuing through much of the night as goods, building materials, and provisions were transported into and around the city under cover of darkness. The Roman poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st century, complained about exactly this kind of nighttime noise disrupting sleep for ordinary Roman residents, a genuinely relatable complaint that feels remarkably contemporary despite being roughly 2,000 years old. Roman residential buildings, particularly the multi-story apartment blocks called insulae that housed the majority of the city's population, created their own distinctive nighttime challenges and rhythms. These buildings, often built quickly and cheaply from wood and low-quality materials, carried significant fire risk,
a danger substantial enough that, as discussed in an earlier chapter, it motivated the creation of the vigiles under Augustus specifically to monitor for fires through the night. Residents of these crowded buildings likely experienced considerably less nighttime quiet and privacy than wealthier Romans in private houses, given thin walls, close quarters, and the general density of insula living. Lamp lighting represents a genuinely interesting, if modestly scaled, feature of certain Roman urban nights. While Rome never developed anything resembling comprehensive public street lighting in the modern sense, evidence suggests that wealthier households and certain public or religious spaces did maintain oil lamps for illumination extending into the evening hours. Consider a composite figure worth imagining, a household slave or freedman specifically responsible for maintaining household lamps in a wealthier Roman home, refilling oil, trimming wicks, and ensuring adequate light for household activities extending past sunset. A role that, while modest, required real practical skill and attentiveness. Roman baths, essential feature of daily social life, sometimes remained open into evening hours in certain periods and locations, according to surviving sources, offering another example of urban social activity extending beyond simple daylight hours. Similarly, certain taverns and food establishments, evidence from Pompeii and other well-preserved sites suggests, catered to evening customers, though the specific hours and social character of these establishments likely varied considerably by location and clientele. Roman religious and civic life also incorporated significant nighttime elements, echoing patterns already discussed in earlier chapters covering Mesopotamian and Egyptian practice. Certain Roman festivals included nighttime processions or rituals, and the Vestal Virgins, responsible for maintaining Rome's sacred hearth fire in the Temple of Vesta, carried forward, in a distinctly Roman religious context, the same fundamental practice of continuous sacred fire tending observed across multiple ancient cultures throughout this documentary. Taken together, this picture of Roman urban night reveals a city that, despite its scale and sophistication, still fundamentally grappled with the same core challenges observed in much smaller, earlier settlements: managing fire risk, maintaining security, providing at least modest illumination, and balancing necessary nighttime economic activity against the basic human need for rest. Rome simply approached these challenges at a scale and with an administrative complexity, from the vigiles to formal traffic regulation, that reflected its status as the largest, most complex urban environment the ancient Mediterranean world had yet produced. Roman entertainment culture also touched on evening hours in certain contexts, though generally in more limited ways than one might assume from popular modern depictions of Roman life. Certain theatrical performances and public spectacles, evidence suggests, occasionally extended into evening hours, particularly during major festivals when normal daily schedules were suspended in favor of extended celebration. Wealthier private dinner parties, a well-documented feature of elite Roman social life, routinely extended well into the evening, sometimes accompanied by music, poetry recitation, and extended conversation, illuminated by numerous household lamps that only the wealthy could afford to keep burning so liberally through a long evening. For the majority of the Roman population, however, living in the crowded insulae discussed earlier, nighttime hours likely offered a considerably more modest, practical experience: a simple meal, limited lamplight used sparingly given its cost, and rest disrupted, as the poet Juvenal complained, by the ongoing rumble of nighttime cart traffic below. This considerable gap between elite and ordinary Roman nighttime experience mirrors a pattern observed across nearly every ancient culture examined in this documentary. Night, like day, was rarely experienced identically across different levels of ancient society, with wealth and status shaping access to light, security, and comfort, just as they shaped nearly every other dimension of ancient daily life.
Away from the scale and complexity of cities like Rome, Ur, or Thebes,
The vast majority of ancient people, throughout nearly every period this documentary has covered, lived in smaller agricultural villages and rural settlements. Night in these communities followed its own distinct rhythm, shaped less by formal civic institutions and more by the direct, practical demands of farming life and close-knit community relationships. Agricultural communities across the ancient world generally organized their days, and by extension their nights, around the practical demands of farming, herding, and household maintenance, with seasonal variation playing a particularly significant role. During planting, and especially harvest seasons, evidence and general agricultural logic both suggest that work likely extended later into the evening than during quieter periods of the agricultural calendar. Farmers taking advantage of any remaining daylight or moonlight to complete time-sensitive tasks before weather or spoilage became a concern. Protecting livestock through the night represented a genuinely significant, recurring concern for rural communities across nearly every ancient culture and period. We've already touched on shepherds remaining with flocks overnight in open grazing conditions, but village-based livestock, kept closer to home in simple enclosures, required their own protective measures. Archaeological evidence from various rural sites includes simple stone or wooden livestock enclosures positioned close to household dwellings, suggesting that keeping animals near enough to hear or respond to nighttime disturbances was a common practical strategy. Village social structure likely shaped nighttime security and community life in ways somewhat different from the more formalized systems seen in major cities. Without resources for a dedicated professional watch force, smaller communities probably relied on the kind of informal shared vigilance discussed in earlier chapters, closely spaced households positioned to hear unusual disturbances, and general community familiarity, everyone recognizing everyone else's normal patterns and movements, making genuinely unusual nighttime activity more likely to be noticed and responded to collectively. Household structures in rural villages, based on archaeological remains from various regions and periods, typically clustered multiple related families or an extended household together, sometimes sharing common courtyard spaces used for cooking, craft work, and evening gathering, echoing the kind of communal firelight gathering discussed in the storytelling chapter. This physical closeness likely reinforced the strong social bonds that rural, agriculturally based communities generally depended on for both economic cooperation and mutual security through the night. Seasonal change and weather would have shaped rural nighttime experience considerably more directly than urban life, where thick city walls and dense building clusters offered somewhat more protection from the elements. Villages in colder climates or during winter months likely saw considerably reduced evening activity outside the home, families gathering close around whatever heat source was available, while warmer seasons and climates probably allowed for more outdoor evening activity, courtyard gatherings, and later bedtimes generally. Religious practice in rural villages, while likely less elaborate than major temple complexes in cities like or Thebes, probably incorporated its own simpler nighttime observances, household shrines, small protective rituals tied to local agricultural cycles, and general participation in the broader lunar or seasonal religious calendars observed across the wider culture, even if practiced with considerably more modest resources than urban religious institutions could command. This village-centered picture of ancient night, quieter and less institutionally documented than the grand temple complexes and organized watch forces of major cities, likely represents the actual lived experience of the substantial majority of ancient people across nearly every civilization this documentary has examined. It was in these smaller, closer communities, gathered around modest household fires, tending shared livestock, listening for familiar and unfamiliar sounds alike, that most ancient nights were actually lived. Seasonal festivals and communal celebrations also punctuated the otherwise routine rhythm of rural village nights, offering welcome variation from ordinary daily patterns.
Harvest festivals, in particular, evidence from various ancient agricultural cultures suggest, often extended into evening hours, communities gathering to celebrate a successful harvest with shared food, music, and communal activity that might continue well past the usual settling-in time for an ordinary working night. These celebrations, tied closely to the practical agricultural calendar discussed throughout this chapter, offered rural communities a meaningful, recurring opportunity for larger social gathering beyond the smaller, more routine household groupings of ordinary evenings. Childbirth and illness, unpredictable by nature, also inevitably disrupted the ordinary rhythm of village night on occasion, requiring the kind of emergency nighttime response and communal mutual aid that rural close-knit communities were generally well positioned to provide. A neighbor roused in the deep hours of the night to assist at difficult birth, or a village elder called upon to offer whatever care or comfort was available for a sudden illness, represents another quiet but genuinely important dimension of rural nighttime life, one built on the same close social bonds and mutual reliance that shaped village security and daily cooperation more broadly.
For those whose livelihood depended on the sea, night presented a particular combination of danger and opportunity that shaped maritime culture across the ancient Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and beyond. Ancient sailors, lacking any instrument more sophisticated than careful observation, relied heavily on the night sky for navigation, particularly on longer voyages that ventured beyond sight of familiar coastlines. The North Star, along with various recognizable constellations, provided crucial directional reference points, a practice documented across multiple ancient seafaring cultures, from Phoenician traders, whose extensive maritime trade network spanned much of the ancient Mediterranean, to later Greek and Roman navigators. Consider a composite figure, a Phoenician sailor, perhaps navigating a trading voyage along the North African coast sometime in the first millennium BCE, watching the night sky carefully to maintain course, particularly during stretches of open water where coastal landmarks were not available for reference. Night sailing carried genuine risks that ancient sailors understood well and generally sought to manage carefully. Reduced visibility made hazards like rocks, shoals, and other vessels considerably more dangerous, and many ancient sailing traditions, evidence from surviving texts suggest, generally preferred to anchor in sheltered locations overnight when practical, rather than continuing to sail through darkness, particularly in unfamiliar or hazardous waters. That said, longer open water voyages where suitable overnight anchorage simply wasn't available necessarily required continued night sailing, relying on the celestial navigation techniques mentioned above. Ancient ports maintained rudimentary forms of nighttime signal fires or beacons intended to guide approaching ships safely toward harbor after dark, representing an early precursor to the much later tradition of formal lighthouses. The famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, constructed during the Ptolemaic period in Egypt and considered one of the ancient world's great engineering achievements, represents perhaps the most sophisticated and well-documented example of this practice, using a large fire reflected and amplified through some combination of mirrors, according to various ancient descriptions, to guide ships safely into Alexandria's busy harbor from a considerable distance, even at night. Fishing communities, distinct from long-distance maritime traders, often develop their own specific relationships with nighttime sea activity, as touched on earlier regarding Mediterranean torch fishing techniques and Nile fishing practices. These smaller-scale coastal fishing operations generally involved more modest risks than open-water trading voyages, but still required real skill in managing boats and equipment safely in darkness, along with practical knowledge of local tides, currents, and fish behavior specific to nighttime hours.
The psychological experience of ancient night sailing, while difficult to reconstruct with certainty from available evidence, likely combined genuine caution and awareness of real danger with a particular kind of vast, humbling beauty, an experience some modern sailors who still navigate primarily by traditional methods continue to describe. A small vessel surrounded by open water beneath an enormous, unobstructed night sky, far from any artificial light, the same brilliant stellar display available to every ancient culture this documentary has examined, here experienced from a uniquely exposed and dependent vantage point, with a sailor's very survival and successful navigation depending directly on his ability to read that sky correctly. Maritime night across the varied contexts of Phoenician trading vessels, Egyptian harbor traffic guided by Alexandria's great lighthouse, and small Mediterranean fishing boats working coastal waters represents one more distinct facet of the broader ancient relationship with darkness this documentary has traced. A relationship built again and again across radically different contexts on careful observation, practical skill, and a hard-won, generally respectful understanding of what night's particular dangers and opportunities actually required. Ancient maritime cultures also developed their own bodies of practical, orally transmitted knowledge specifically concerning nighttime sailing conditions, distinct but related to the more formal astronomical traditions discussed earlier in this documentary. Experienced sailors likely accumulated detailed, practical familiarity with how particular coastlines, currents, and typical weather patterns behaved differently at night compared to day, knowledge built through repeated experience rather than formal written instruction, and passed down through direct mentorship from experienced sailors to newer crew members. This kind of practical maritime knowledge, while far less thoroughly documented in surviving ancient sources than temple astronomy or formal religious practice, likely represented an enormously important, if largely invisible, body of expertise underlying the safe operation of ancient Mediterranean trade and communication networks. Surviving ancient sources also mention specific religious practices connected to safe sea travel, including offerings or prayers made before undertaking a nighttime voyage, reflecting the genuine anxiety and uncertainty that even experienced sailors likely felt when committing themselves and their cargo to open water in darkness. Various ancient cultures maintained protective deities specifically associated with safe sea travel, and evidence suggests that sailors facing a difficult night crossing may well have combined their considerable practical skill with genuine religious appeal for additional safety and protection. A blending of practical expertise and spiritual reassurance that echoes patterns observed throughout this documentary in contexts ranging from household protective charms to temple vigil keeping.
Having traveled from Ice Age hearths through the temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the crowded streets of Rome, quiet farming villages, and open waters navigated by starlight, it's worth pausing to consider what connects these many different ancient nights, and what, if anything, remains of these patterns in how humans experience darkness today. The most obvious continuity is technological in a broad sense. Fire, in its earliest controlled form, established a pattern of extending human capability into the night that has continued, in modified form, through every subsequent innovation touched on in this documentary. The carefully shaped stone lamps of Paleolithic cave painters, the oil lamps of Mesopotamian watchmen and Egyptian households, the great signal fire atop the lighthouse of Alexandria, all the way through to Rome's more limited but genuine attempts at extending household and public illumination into evening hours. Each of these represents the same underlying impulse to push back in some modest way against the limitations darkness naturally imposes.
Social continuity appears just as clearly, and perhaps more movingly, across the evidence this documentary has examined. The pattern of gathering, whether around a Paleolithic hearth, a Mesopotamian household fire, or a village courtyard discussed in an earlier chapter, for warmth, safety, and shared activity, including storytelling, appears remarkably consistent across an enormous span of time and geography. This suggests something close to a genuine, deeply rooted human tendency, not merely a cultural habit particular to any single society, but a broadly shared response to the specific conditions night imposes: reduced visibility, increased vulnerability, and a natural pause in the more physically demanding work of daylight hours. The organized management of nighttime security, from informal shared vigilance in small communities through to Rome's more elaborate vigiles, reflects another consistent thread: recognition that darkness, while manageable, required deliberate collective effort to navigate safely. This pattern, in modified and vastly more technologically sophisticated form, continues directly into modern urban life, where formal policing, emergency response, and infrastructure like street lighting represent a direct, if much expanded, descendant of the same basic impulse that motivated a Mesopotamian city to pay watchmen to guard its gates. Perhaps most striking, though, is the continuity in how ancient people treated night as meaningful, rather than simply as an absence or an inconvenience to be managed. The religious significance attached to lunar cycles, sacred fire tending, dream interpretation, and nighttime vigil keeping, examined across multiple cultures in this documentary, suggests that ancient people generally did not experience night as empty time. It held its own distinct character, its own particular kind of significance, whether understood through the lens of Egyptian solar cosmology, Mesopotamian dream omens, or the quieter, more intimate significance of an elder's stories shared by firelight. Some of these ancient patterns have faded considerably in modern life, particularly in societies with widespread artificial lighting that has fundamentally changed the relationship between human activity and natural darkness. Many people today rarely experience the truly dark, star-filled sky that was simply an ordinary nightly feature of ancient life, discussed earlier as a genuinely universal ancient experience, equally available to a Nile fisherman, a Babylonian priest, and a Phoenician sailor. This particular loss, while perhaps not often noticed in daily modern life, represents a genuine, measurable change in human experience, a disconnection from something that shaped human culture, religion, and practical life for the overwhelming majority of our species' history. Other patterns, though, persist in recognizable form even now. Families still gather for evening meals and conversation, though perhaps around different kinds of light. Bakers still rise before dawn to prepare fresh bread, much as their Roman counterparts did at Pompeii. And the basic biological and psychological need for rest, security, and some sense of order and meaning through the night's vulnerable hours remains, at its core, remarkably unchanged, however differently we now meet that need with modern tools and technologies ancient people could never have imagined. Historians studying the broader arc of this change, from a night governed by fire, starlight, and careful human attention, towards one increasingly shaped by artificial illumination available at the flip of a switch, generally describe it as a gradual, uneven process, unfolding over many centuries and varying enormously by region and by wealth rather than any single dramatic turning point. Oil lamps gave way eventually to more efficient candles in some regions, then to gas lighting in certain 19th century cities, and finally to the electric lighting that has within only the last century or so become genuinely widespread across much of the world. Measured against the enormous span of time this documentary has covered, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years to the earliest controlled hearths, this final transformation represents an almost startlingly recent development, a reminder that the deeply dark, star-filled ancient night explored throughout this documentary remained the ordinary human experience for the overwhelming majority of our species' entire history.
We began this documentary with a simple, gentle question. What did the night actually feel like before electric light existed anywhere on Earth? Having traveled across such an enormous stretch of time and geography together, it's worth taking a few quiet moments now to simply sit with what we've gathered along the way. We've seen night as danger, requiring careful attention, shared vigilance, and eventually, in cities like Rome and organized watch systems built specifically to manage the vulnerabilities darkness imposed. We've seen night as opportunity, a chance for cooler, more comfortable fishing on the Nile, for essential trades like baking to proceed while the rest of the community slept, for sailors to navigate open water using nothing but careful observation of the stars above them. We've seen night as sacred, wrapped in religious meaning across nearly every culture this documentary examined, from Ra's mythological underworld journey to the sacred flames tended continuously by dedicated priests and priestesses across multiple traditions. And perhaps most gently of all, we've seen night as simply, quietly social. Families and communities gathered close around modest fires, sharing food, warmth, and stories, generation after generation, in patterns that likely stretch back in some recognizable form to the very earliest controlled fires tended by our distant ancestors hundreds of thousands of years before any of the great civilizations this documentary explored had even begun. If there's a single thread worth carrying with you from tonight's journey, perhaps it's this. Night has never really been empty time, not for the vast majority of human history. It was managed, yes, sometimes with real effort and genuine caution, but it was also filled consistently and across an extraordinary range of otherwise very different cultures, with warmth, connection, quiet labor, careful observation, and a kind of meaning that people clearly felt was worth their deliberate attention, worth tending, quite literally, like a fire that needed to be kept through the darkest hours. We've traveled through cold cave mouths in Ice Age Europe, watched with an imagined Sumerian gatekeeper as city gates swung shut at dusk, sat quietly with an Egyptian household elder as she prepared her family's evening meal, listened for the rumble of Roman cartwheels on stone streets, and stood beside a Phoenician sailor scanning the night sky for the steady point of a guiding star. Each of these moments, reconstructed carefully from fragments of evidence, historians' careful interpretation, and the honest acknowledgement of what remains genuinely uncertain, represents just one small piece of an enormous, largely unrecorded human experience. Billions of individual nights lived by people whose names we will never know, each one navigating darkness in their own particular way, shaped by their own particular time and place. As you settle now into your own night, in circumstances so different from nearly everyone and everything we've discussed this evening, perhaps there's some quiet comfort available in that long continuity. The specific dangers have changed enormously. The specific beliefs and rituals have shifted, evolved, and in many cases faded from active practice. But the basic, gentle human pattern, gathering in, settling down, seeking warmth and safety and rest as darkness falls, connects you in this quiet moment to an almost unbroken chain of human experience stretching back further than history itself can clearly record.
This documentary was researched and produced with the assistance of AI tools, drawing on archaeological research, primary historical sources, and academic scholarship. Where historical certainty was limited, that uncertainty has been noted throughout rather than presented as settled fact. Thank you for spending this time with Bedtime Story Media. If tonight's journey through the ancient night helped you settle into your own, consider subscribing. We'll be back soon with another quiet corner of history to explore together. Sleep well and rest easy. The same quiet darkness that once settled gently over a Mesopotamian courtyard, a Nile fishing boat, and a small stone hearth in an Ice Age cave has, in its own way, settled over you tonight as well.